My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I worked as a senior project strategist at a mid-sized consulting firm in Seattle. If you had met me in the office, you probably wouldn't have remembered me immediately. Not because I was shy, and not because I lacked confidence, but because I wasn't loud. I didn't interrupt people in meetings. I didn't dominate conversations. I didn't speak just to hear my own voice, the way some people seem to do in corporate environments. I listened. I took notes. I asked questions that most people didn't notice until later, when those questions quietly changed the direction of a project. Some colleagues called that professional. Others called it reliable. But a few people interpreted it as something else entirely. They thought it meant I was harmless, the kind of person who would fix problems behind the scenes, stay late without complaining, and quietly make everyone else look prepared when clients walked in. The kind of person who would never push back. For years, that assumption worked in everyone else's favor. And for the most part, I let it. Not because I didn't see what was happening, but because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is watch how people behave when they believe you have no power. The story I'm about to tell you began on a Tuesday morning, 6:02 a.m., presentation day, a client pitch worth $2.3 million. I had arrived earlier than anyone else, to prepare the conference room, check the data visuals, and rehearse a few final points. That wasn't unusual for me. Preparation had always been part of how I worked, but that morning, something small happened that shouldn't have happened at all. When I reached the office door and held up my keycard, the reader blinked red. I tried again. Red. Again. Red. At first I assumed it was a glitch, but then I noticed something else. The building lights were on. Inside. And someone had already arrived. That was the moment I realized something wasn't right, because my access had worked perfectly fine the night before. And presentation day was not the kind of morning when a senior strategist's building access should suddenly stop working. Now, this story isn't about revenge. There are no shouting matches, no dramatic scenes in boardrooms, no cinematic moments where someone storms out and slams a door. That's not how real consequences usually look. Most of the time, they arrive quietly. They unfold slowly. And by the time people understand what's happening, it's already too late to change anything. What happened after that locked door eventually changed my career, my sense of self, and the way several people in my company understood power. But to explain how we got there, I have to start with something simpler: who I was to them, and why they thought locking me out of the office at 6 in the morning would never matter. Before we continue, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment when someone underestimated you so completely that they didn't even realize they were creating their own problem? In our office, people like to say that success was about visibility. The louder voice in the meeting, the person who summarized the discussion at the end as if they had guided it the entire time. The one who could turn a simple idea into a confident speech. That wasn't me. My name was usually attached to documents, not conversations. If you asked my coworkers to describe me back then, most of them would have said something like, Emily, oh, she's solid. Reliable, organized, calm. Those are the words people use for someone they depend on. But they're also the words people use when they don't think someone is competing with them. In a consulting firm, that distinction matters more than people admit. Our company wasn't huge, about 60 employees, but the hierarchy was clear. Partners at the top, directors beneath them. Then, senior strategists like me. And finally, the analysts who rotated through projects every few months. Technically, my role placed me closer to leadership than support staff. But the culture of the office didn't always follow the org chart. Some people were seen, others were simply useful. I was the person who double-checked financial models at midnight before client presentations, the one who rewrote slides so they actually made sense, the one who noticed when the numbers on page 7 contradicted the chart on page 14. None of that work was dramatic. Most of it happened quietly, long before anyone stepped into a conference room, which meant the credit often belonged to whoever was standing at the front of the room when the client nodded in approval. Over time, I stopped expecting recognition for it, not out of resentment, just realism. Consulting firms reward two kinds of people, the ones who sell the work, and the ones who make sure it doesn't fall apart. I had become very good at the second category. For the most part, I didn't mind. My projects ran smoothly, clients trusted my analysis, and the partners relied on me when deadlines were tight. But there was one subtle side effect of being the reliable one. People stopped imagining that you might have limits, or boundaries, or ambitions beyond quietly supporting the team. They assume you will always show up early, always stay late, always fix the mistake that someone else made, and eventually, they stop asking. They just expect it. Looking back now, I realized something else was happening during those years. While everyone else focused on presentations and promotions, I was watching patterns. Who interrupted whom during meetings? Whose ideas were repeated 5 minutes later by someone else and suddenly taken seriously? Which clients trusted which voices in the room? And which decisions were made long before any official meeting took place? Observation became a habit for me. Partly because I enjoyed understanding systems, but partly because when you're the quiet person in the room, people often forget you're paying attention. By the time the story I'm about to tell unfolded, I had been with the company for 6 years, long enough to know every major client account, long enough to understand how influence actually moved through the office, and long enough to realize something important. Some people believed I was invisible, others believed I was harmless. Neither assumption was completely true, but at the time, they hadn't learned that yet. And the morning my keycard stopped working, that misunderstanding finally started to matter. If you asked anyone in our office when the tension between Daniel Mercer and me began, most of them would probably say they never noticed any tension at all. Daniel was a director, one level above me in the company hierarchy. He was charismatic in the way consulting firms tend to reward. Confident voice, quick humor, the kind of person who could summarize a complicated idea in 3 sharp sentences and make it sound like it had always been obvious. Clients liked him, partners trusted him, and for the first few years I worked there, we were on several projects together. On paper, our collaboration worked well. Daniel handled client relationships and high-level positioning. I handled the structural analysis behind the strategy. It was a system that benefited both of us. At least, that's how it appeared. The first small moment that stayed with me happened during a quarterly strategy meeting about 2 years before the presentation day I mentioned earlier. The room was full, partners, directors, and several senior strategists. We were discussing a logistics client whose operating costs had quietly risen by almost 12% over 18 months. Most of the conversation was circling around surface-level explanations. Fuel prices, staffing adjustments, temporary supply disruptions. I had spent the previous week reviewing the internal data. Late that night, I had noticed something unusual, a pattern in their distribution routing. It wasn't dramatic, but it explained the cost increase almost perfectly. So when there was a pause in the discussion, I spoke up. Not loudly, just clearly. I think the issue may actually be the routing structure, I said. There's a compounding overlap between regional distribution zones. A few people glanced at the screen. I explained it in about 30 seconds. The room went quiet for a moment. Not because it was revolutionary, but because it made sense. Then Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Right, he said. And he turned towards the partners. What Emily's pointing out is essentially that the distribution zones were layered inefficiently over time. He stood up, walked to the screen, and began outlining the same explanation I had just given. Only now it sounded larger, more strategic, more polished. By the time he finished, one of the partners nodded. "That's a strong angle, Daniel," he said. "We should pursue that." The conversation moved on. No one corrected anything. No one questioned it. And Daniel didn't look at me. At the time, I told myself something simple. This is just how meetings work. Ideas move quickly. People build on each other's thoughts. Credit isn't always assigned precisely. It wasn't worth making a scene over something so small. So I wrote a few notes in my black notebook, the one I always carried. Not because I was angry, just because I had a habit of recording things that seemed interesting. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. As people gathered their laptops and coffee cups, Daniel passed by my chair. He gave a quick smile. "Good catch earlier," he said quietly. It sounded friendly, almost appreciative. Then he walked out of the room with the partners. That moment lasted maybe 10 seconds, and if you looked at it from the outside, it seemed completely harmless. But small moments have a way of revealing patterns. Not immediately. Sometimes it takes repetition before your mind recognizes what it's seeing. At the time, I closed my notebook and went back to my desk. I told myself it was nothing, just one small moment in a busy office, but that was the first time I realized something subtle about the way Daniel worked. He didn't interrupt people, he didn't dismiss ideas, he simply absorbed them. And by the time they reappeared in the conversation, they belonged to him. It was a small cut, so small that no one else seemed to notice, but I remembered it. And over time, it stopped feeling accidental. After that meeting, nothing dramatic changed. Daniel didn't become openly dismissive. He didn't undermine me in obvious ways. In fact, if someone had asked me directly whether we worked well together, I probably would have said yes, because technically, we did. Projects moved forward, clients were satisfied, deadlines were met. But once you notice a pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. Over the next year, the same kind of moment appeared again and again. Always small, always subtle, always easy to ignore if you want to. Sometimes it happened in meetings. I would outline a risk in a proposal, something buried in the numbers or timeline. A few minutes later, Daniel would restate the concern in broader terms. Suddenly, the room would pause. Someone would nod. "Good point," a partner might say. The idea itself hadn't changed, only the voice delivering it. Other times it happened during client calls. I would send a detailed briefing beforehand, outlining the analysis and the recommended approach. During the call, Daniel would summarize the strategy. He rarely claimed the work outright. He simply spoke about it as if the conclusions had emerged naturally from the team, which technically they had. But the team usually meant me. At first, I told myself something practical. This is how leadership works. Directors translate analysis into narrative. Strategists provide the underlying structure. Both roles matter. It wasn't inaccurate. But there was another detail that slowly became harder to ignore. My name was rarely attached to the strategic conclusions when they reached the higher levels of the company. It stayed in the documents, in the drafts, in the internal notes. But when ideas reached the room where decisions were made, the attribution had already softened. I could have corrected it. There were moments when it would have been easy. A quick sentence during a meeting. Something simple like, "Just to clarify, that's the model I built last week." But I never said it. Not because I was afraid, and not because I lacked confidence. The truth was simpler. Correcting people in that environment carried a social cost, especially when the person speaking was a director. It made the room uncomfortable. It made you look territorial, defensive, and consulting firms, for all their talk about meritocracy, quietly reward people who make the room feel smooth. So instead, I kept doing the work, and Daniel kept doing what he did best, turning analysis into a confident explanation. From the outside, the system worked perfectly. Our projects were successful, clients renewed their contracts, and the partners often paired us on high-value accounts. Sometimes colleagues even joked about it. "You two are a good combination," one analyst told me once. "Daniel handles the big picture, and you make sure the details actually work." He meant it as a compliment, and in a way, it was. But compliments can also reveal expectations. Over time, a quiet role begins to harden into something permanent. People stop asking what you want. They assume you're comfortable exactly where you are. The reliable one, the steady one, the person who makes things work but never asks to stand at the front of the room. And the strange thing was, for a long time, I allowed that assumption to exist. Not because it was true, but observing the system from the inside had its own kind of advantage. People reveal far more about themselves when they believe you are not competing with them. They speak more freely, they make decisions more openly, and sometimes, without realizing it, they start to depend on you more than they understand. By the time the presentation day arrived, the morning my keycard stopped working, I had spent years inside that quiet role. Reliable, useful, predictable. To most people in the office, I was simply the person who made the strategy work. What they didn't realize was that while the role looked invisible from the outside, it had given me something valuable: perspective. And perspective has a way of changing the meaning of small moments, especially the ones people assume you'll forget. At some point, Every workplace quietly assigns you a role, not the one written in your contract, the one people expect you to play. And once that role settles in, it becomes surprisingly difficult to change. In our office, mine was clear. I was the person who made things work. If a presentation needed restructuring the night before a client meeting, someone would message me. If an analyst's numbers didn't quite add up, the spreadsheet somehow ended up on my desk. If a director needed a strategy outline refined before showing it to a partner, it was usually me who reviewed it. No one officially asked me to become that person. It happened gradually, one solved problem at a time. And over the years, something interesting occurred. People began to trust my work completely. But they didn't necessarily think of me as someone who needed to be visible. In consulting firms, visibility and reliability are not always the same currency. The people who speak often get remembered. The people who fix things quietly get relied upon. I had become the second kind. At first, I didn't question it. There's a certain satisfaction in being competent enough that others depend on you. Projects moved smoothly when I was involved. Clients rarely pushed back on our recommendations. And internally, I had access to an enormous amount of information simply because I was the one reviewing everything. But the longer you stay in a quiet role, the more people begin to treat it as permanent. A few small moments made that clear. One afternoon, during a planning discussion for a major retail client, a partner casually said something that stayed with me. "We'll have Daniel present the strategy," he said, looking around the table. "Emily can make sure the analysis is airtight." No one meant anything negative by it. In fact, the comment was meant as reassurance. If Emily reviewed the analysis, the work would be solid. But the sentence revealed the expectation perfectly. Daniel presented. I supported. Another time, an analyst asked me a question while we were preparing slides late in the evening. "Why don't you ever lead these presentations?" she said. She asked it with genuine curiosity, not criticism. I smiled a little. "Different people have different strengths," I told her. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it also wasn't the full answer. The truth was that by then, the system had already placed me in a specific category: reliable, calm, useful, and most importantly, non-threatening. When people believe you are not competing for the spotlight, they relax around you. Directors speak more openly. Partners share more context than they normally would. You hear conversations that aren't meant to be strategic briefings. You see how decisions are actually made. Over time, that position gave me something unusual: a complete view of the company's inner workings. Which clients generated the most revenue? Which directors were truly trusted by partners? Which projects quietly struggled behind polished presentations? And which deals were far more fragile than they appeared? Most people inside the office were focused on climbing the ladder. Promotions, recognition, leadership roles. But from my quieter position, I had something else: clarity. I could see the structure of the system without needing to fight for attention inside it. At the time, I didn't think of that perspective as power. It simply felt like understanding. And understanding rarely causes immediate change. It just sits there quietly, waiting for the moment when it becomes useful. By the time the morning of the locked door arrived, my role in the office had been firmly established. To everyone else, I was the dependable strategist behind the scenes, the person who showed up early, stayed calm, solved problems, and never made things complicated. Which is why when someone decided to quietly remove my building access at 6 in the morning and the most important presentation day of the quarter, they probably assumed the situation would stay simple, that I would wait, call security, maybe send a message asking for help. And when the door eventually opened, everything would continue exactly as before. But roles only remain stable until the moment someone stops accepting them. And that morning, something in me had already begun to shift. The morning of the presentation started earlier than usual for me. Not because I was nervous. Preparation had always been my way of staying calm. The client we were pitching that day was a logistics company, expanding its distribution network across 3 states. The contract value, if we secured it, was about $2.3 million over 2 years. It was the kind of deal that directors liked to present, and the kind of analysis that usually landed on my desk weeks beforehand. I woke up around 4:45 a.m., the way I often did before important meetings. The city outside my apartment was still quiet, Seattle's early morning fog sitting low between the buildings. Coffee. Shower. One last review of my notes. I flipped through my black leather notebook while eating a piece of toast at the kitchen counter. The presentation structure was already clear in my mind. Market overview, distribution inefficiencies, the optimization model I had built over the previous month. Daniel would introduce the strategy. I would step in during the technical sections if the client asked detailed questions. That was the normal pattern. And until that morning, I had no reason to think anything about the day would be unusual. I arrived downtown a little after 5:55 a.m. The streets were mostly empty, except for delivery vans and the occasional commuter heading toward the train station. Our office building was a modern glass tower that looked almost reflective in the early light. Inside, the lobby security desk was usually quiet at that hour. I liked arriving early. It gave me time to adjust the presentation room, check the screen resolution, test the clicker, review the slide order without the usual background noise of the office. Preparation to me had always been a form of respect. Respect for the client, respect for the work, and honestly, respect for myself. I walked through the lobby with my laptop bag over one shoulder and held my keycard toward the elevator security gate. The reader blinked. Red. I paused. Sometimes the scanner needed a second attempt, so I tried again. Red. A third time. Red again. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the small panel. It didn't make sense. My keycard had worked perfectly the evening before when I left the office around 7. Access permissions don't usually disappear overnight, especially not for someone scheduled to help present a multi-million-dollar proposal. I stepped slightly to the side and tried the secondary reader near the visitor desk. Red. Behind the glass security barrier, the lobby lights reflected faintly across the polished floor. And that's when I noticed something else. The office floor lights upstairs were already on. You could see them faintly through the elevator shaft windows. Someone had arrived before me. That was unusual. Most people in our office arrived between 8:30 and 9. Even Daniel rarely appeared before 8 on presentation days. I stood there quietly for a moment, my keycard still in my hand. My first thought was technical. Maybe the building system had reset overnight. Maybe IT had accidentally updated permissions. But then another thought crossed my mind. A smaller one. The kind of thought that doesn't feel dramatic when it first appears. Just curious. Because building access changes usually generate notification emails, and I hadn't received anything. I pulled out my phone and checked my inbox. Nothing. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not panic, just a very quiet kind of awareness. Because after 6 years in that company, I understood systems. And systems rarely malfunction in ways that affect only one person. Especially not on this morning of a major client presentation. I tried my card once more. Red. Then I stepped back from the gate and looked up toward the office floors again. Someone was already inside, and whoever it was, knew I wouldn't be. That realization didn't make me react immediately. Instead, I did something I'd done many times during my career. I paused, and I started thinking. Most people assume that when something unexpected happens at work, the natural reaction is immediate action. Call someone, send a message, fix the problem as quickly as possible. And for most situations, that's true. But standing in that quiet lobby at 6:07 a.m., staring at a keycard reader that suddenly didn't recognize me, I had an unusual advantage. I wasn't in a hurry to panic. Years of working behind the scenes had taught me something important about corporate environments. The first reaction often reveals less than the second one. So instead of rushing to call IT or messaging Daniel, I simply stepped away from the security gate and sat down in one of the chairs near the lobby windows. From there, I could see the elevator bank clearly. The building itself was still quiet. A cleaning crew moved slowly across the far side of the lobby. The security guard behind the desk nodded politely, but didn't ask questions. Early arrivals weren't unusual in consulting firms. I opened my laptop, not because I needed to work, but because staying calm gave me time to observe. My phone screen lit up with the time again. 6:09 a.m. If my access had been removed accidentally, someone would likely notice soon. Daniel would probably arrive within an hour, and the issue would be corrected quickly. But if the access change had been intentional, then someone inside the office already knew exactly what was happening. That thought didn't feel dramatic, just logical, because access permissions in our building weren't controlled by the lobby staff. They were managed internally through our company's administrative system, which meant only a few departments had the authority to change them. Human resources, IT security, and occasionally senior leadership when restructuring teams. None of those things was supposed to happen quietly overnight. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked again toward the elevator. Still no movement. My laptop screen reflected the faint morning light from the windows behind me. That was when my phone vibrated softly. A message. For a moment, I expected it to be Daniel, or maybe one of the analysts is asking about the slide deck. Instead, it was from Maya, one of the junior analysts assigned to the project. Morning, Emily. Quick question. Do you want the updated cost chart on slide 14, or keep the earlier version? I looked at the message for a second. Maya was clearly already inside the office, which meant at least one other team member had arrived, and apparently her access worked perfectly fine. I typed a short response. Keep the updated version. I'll review when I get upstairs. Then I paused before sending another message. Something simple. Who's there already? 3 small dots appeared almost immediately. Just me and Daniel so far, she replied. That answer confirmed something quietly. Daniel was already inside the office. At 6:10 a.m., earlier than he had ever arrived for any project we'd worked on together. I closed my laptop slowly. At that point, most people probably would have walked to the security desk and asked for assistance, or called Daniel directly. But something about the situation didn't feel like a technical error anymore. It felt arranged. And arrangements reveal more when you don't interrupt them too quickly. So I stayed where I was. I watched the elevator doors, listened to the quiet hum of the lobby air system, and waited. Because silence can mean many things in a workplace. Sometimes it means discomfort. Sometimes it means hesitation. But occasionally, silence becomes a choice. And when people believe your silence means weakness, they often continue behaving exactly the way they planned, which makes their intentions much easier to understand. While I sat in the lobby that morning, another realization slowly settled in. The situation at the door was unusual, but it also revealed something important. For years, the role I had played in the company, the reliable strategist, the quiet problem solver, had created a kind of invisibility. And invisibility, when used carefully, can become a form of access. Not physical access, information access. Because the truth was that my work had always required me to see parts of the company most people ignored. Every major proposal, every client data model, every revised contract timeline. They all passed through my desk at some point. Not because I asked for them, but someone had to make sure the numbers were correct before they were presented. That habit of reviewing everything had gradually turned into something else. Documentation. Not in a suspicious way, just organized thinking. Whenever I worked on a large project, I kept detailed notes in my black leather notebook. Dates, decisions, changes to strategy. Which director requested which revision? Which partner approved which version of a proposal? At first, the notebook had simply been a tool to keep complex projects straight. Consulting work moves quickly. Multiple teams, shifting deadlines, dozens of moving parts. Without clear notes, it becomes easy to forget why certain decisions were made. But over the years, something interesting happened. My notes began forming patterns about how projects evolved, who influenced which decisions, which ideas originated where, and sometimes, which ideas quietly changed ownership between meetings. None of that had felt particularly important at the time. It was just the natural result of careful work. But sitting in that lobby chair, thinking about the red light on the security scanner, those patterns suddenly felt more relevant. Because when someone assumes you are only supporting their work, they rarely worry about what you remember, or what you record. I opened my laptop again and pulled up the presentation file for the logistics client. The final slide deck was saved on our shared project drive. Last modified 11:42 p.m. the previous night. That timestamp made sense. I had finished refining the optimization model late in the evening, and uploaded the final numbers before leaving the office. Slide 14, the cost distribution chart Maya had mentioned earlier, contained the most important data in the presentation. It showed exactly how the client could reduce operating costs by restructuring their distribution zones, a simple visual. But behind it sat 3 weeks of modelling and analysis. Without that chart, the strategy would look incomplete. And suddenly a quiet question crossed my mind. If Daniel had arrived at the office before 6 a.m., what exactly was he doing there? Directors usually spend presentation mornings reviewing talking points or adjusting narrative flow. They didn't typically rebuild technical slides. I checked the version history of the document. One more modification appeared. 5:58 a.m. Edited by Daniel Mercer. I studied the timestamp for a moment. 2 minutes before, I had walked into the lobby. That meant Daniel had opened the presentation file almost immediately after arriving. Curious, I clicked the version comparison tool. The change itself was small, but precise. The title of slide 14 had been adjusted. Originally, it read, Distribution Optimization Model, Emily Carter. Now it simply reads, Distribution Optimization Model. The attribution line had disappeared. Nothing else had changed. The data remained the same. The chart remained the same. Even the explanatory notes in the slide comments were still there. Only my name had been removed. For a moment, I just looked at the screen. Not because I felt surprised, but because the pattern I had been observing for years had suddenly become very clear. This wasn't about the slide itself, and it certainly wasn't about the small line of text at the bottom of the page. It was about something simpler, control over the narrative. The person presenting the idea often becomes the person remembered for it. And the quiet strategist behind the model becomes background. Daniel probably assumed that by the time the client meeting began, I would be inside the office preparing the room like always. The slide would appear during the presentation. No one would question where the model came from, and the story would unfold exactly the way it usually did. But there was one variable he hadn't expected that morning. I wasn't upstairs. I was still sitting in the lobby, watching the system play out. And for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't sure I intended to follow the role everyone assumed I would play. When you notice something important at work, there's a natural temptation to react immediately, to correct it, to confront it, to send a message that says, I saw what you did. But over the years, I had learned that immediate reactions rarely produce clarity. They produce explanations, and explanations have a way of reshaping the story before you fully understand it. So instead of messaging Daniel about the slide change, I did something else. I started reviewing the rest of the presentation history. Our project drive kept detailed records of every edit made to shared files. Normally, those logs were just administrative clutter, timestamps, version numbers, small formatting tweaks. But when you look at them carefully, they can tell a story. I scrolled through the previous 2 weeks of revisions. Most of the edits were mine. Data adjustments, model recalculations, structural changes to the slide order. Daniel's edits appeared occasionally, mostly in the narrative sections, client messaging, executive summaries, the opening slides where tone mattered more than numbers. That was normal, but this morning's edit stood out because it was so specific. Not a narrative adjustment, not a change to the strategy, just the removal of one line of attribution. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked around the quiet lobby again. The security guard was speaking softly on the phone behind his desk. Outside the glass entrance doors, the early morning light had begun turning the street a pale grey blue. Inside the office upstairs, Daniel and Maya were probably reviewing the presentation, preparing for the meeting, and if everything went according to plan, the client would arrive at 9 a.m. Daniel would introduce the strategy, slide 14 would appear on the screen. And the optimization model, the one I had spent weeks refining, would look like part of the broader narrative he was presenting, a small detail in a larger story. Most clients never ask where a model originates. They care about whether it works. And Daniel was excellent at explaining why strategies worked. For a moment, I closed my laptop again, not because I was finished thinking, but because the situation had become clear enough that I didn't need to keep searching for evidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was simply the continuation of a pattern that had grown slowly over time, subtle enough that it rarely looked intentional. Ideas shifting voices, analysis turning into narrative, credits softening around the edges. The difference today was that something had interrupted the usual flow. My keycard. That small red light at the security gate had created a pause in the system, and pauses reveal structure. If I had walked into the office normally at 6 that morning, I probably would have opened the presentation file, noticed the missing attribution line, and quietly added it back, or ignored it entirely. The meeting would have proceeded as planned, and by lunchtime, the moment would have disappeared into the background noise of another successful pitch. But instead, I was sitting outside the system, watching it. And that distance gave me something unusual: perspective. I opened my notebook and wrote down 3 simple lines. 6:02 a.m. Keycard access denied. 5:58 a.m. Slide edit removing attribution. Daniel is already in the office. Not because I needed proof of anything yet, just because documenting events had always been my habit. Then I closed the notebook. What I had discovered wasn't dramatic. There was no hidden scandal, no shocking secret waiting to explode. Just a quiet confirmation of something I had suspected for a long time. The structure of the system, and my place inside it. Or more accurately, the place others expected me to stay. But clarity has a strange effect on people. Once you see a system clearly enough, you begin to realize how many choices you actually have inside it. And that morning, sitting quietly in the lobby while the office above prepared for a multi-million-dollar presentation, I realized something else. For the first time since joining the company, I didn't have to play my assigned role. Not today. Not anymore. And once that thought appeared, another question followed naturally. If I wasn't going to follow the script everyone expected, what exactly was I going to do instead? Once you understand a situation clearly, the next step is rarely action. It's a choice. And most choices in professional environments are quieter than people imagine. They aren't dramatic crossroads. They're simply different paths you could take next. Sitting in the lobby that morning, I realized I had several options. The first was the obvious one. I could walk over to the security desk, explain that my keycard wasn't working, and ask them to contact building management. Within a few minutes, someone would likely reset the system or escort me upstairs. By 6:30, I'd be in the conference room reviewing the slides with Daniel. The meeting would proceed normally. Slide 14 would appear during the presentation, and Daniel would explain the optimization model as part of his broader strategy narrative. Technically, the project would still succeed. The client would see a clear solution. Our firm would likely win the contract. From a business perspective, everything would function exactly as intended. The second option was more direct. I could send Daniel a message, something simple. My keycard isn't working, can you let me in? That would force an immediate response. He would either come downstairs or call security. The situation would resolve quickly, but it would also give him time to reshape the narrative before the meeting began. Perhaps the slide attribution would quietly return. Perhaps it wouldn't. Either way, the moment would disappear before anyone else ever noticed it existed. There was also a third option: confrontation. I could message him about the slide change directly, ask why my name had been removed, raise the issue before the presentation. But confrontation in corporate environments rarely produces clarity. It produces explanations, and explanations are designed to smooth over discomfort, not reveal intentions, which meant the outcome would likely be a brief conversation and a polite apology. Nothing truly changed the structure of the situation. For a few minutes, I simply sat there, considering those paths. All of them were reasonable. All of them would preserve the normal rhythm of the office. But there was another possibility, a quieter one. I could do nothing. Do not call security, not message Daniel, do not interrupt the system that was currently unfolding upstairs. Just wait. Because if my absence continued long enough, the situation would begin to create its own consequences. Daniel would eventually notice I wasn't in the office. The team would wonder where I was, and the presentation, the one built around the analysis I had developed, would approach without the person who understood the model best. None of that would cause chaos. Daniel was capable. He understood the overall strategy. But there's a difference between presenting a model and answering the detailed questions behind it, especially with clients who specialize in logistics operations. They tend to ask precise questions, questions about assumptions, variables, operational constraints, the kind of questions directors usually redirect to the analyst or strategist who built the model. Normally, that person would be me. I looked at my phone again. 6:21 a.m. The morning was moving slowly, but the presentation clock was already ticking, and that was when the decision became surprisingly simple. For 6 years, I had adapted myself to the system inside that company, adjusted my role, stayed quiet when it was easier for everyone else. But today, the system had created a small disruption on its own. A locked door, a missing name, a morning that wasn't unfolding the way it usually did. And instead of rushing to fix it, I decided to let the situation continue, not out of anger, not as a strategy of revenge, just curiosity. Because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do in a system is step slightly outside it and watch what happens next. So I stayed in the lobby chair, closed my laptop, and waited. By 6:30 a.m., the lobby had started to wake up. A few early employees from other companies in the building passed through the security gates. The quiet rhythm of the morning shifted slightly. Footsteps, elevator chimes, the low murmur of greetings. I was still sitting near the window. Daniel still hadn't contacted me. That detail mattered more than anything else, because if my keycard failure had been accidental, someone upstairs would have noticed by now. Maya had already messaged me earlier, which meant the team assumed I was somewhere in the building, preparing the room, checking the presentation equipment, doing the things I always did before important meetings, the role I had quietly filled for years. I checked my phone again. No new messages, no missed calls. That silence told me something. Daniel wasn't expecting to need me immediately. He was confident enough to continue preparing the presentation without checking whether I had arrived. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was simply the result of the system we had worked in for years. Directors presented, strategists supported. The structure had always functioned smoothly. But there was one element Daniel probably hadn't considered that morning. The questions. Clients rarely sit quietly through consulting presentations, especially not operations executives responsible for multi-million-dollar distribution networks. They ask about assumptions, about variables, about how the model behaves when conditions change. The optimization model on slide 14 wasn't just a chart. Behind it were hundreds of data relationships, constraints, trade-offs, all things I could explain easily because I had built them. But explanations like that are difficult to improvise, especially when a room full of logistics executives begins asking detailed operational questions. I opened my notebook again. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but I wanted to record the morning clearly. 6:02 a.m. Keycard denied. 5:58 a.m. Slide attribution removed. Daniel is already in the office. Then I added another line. 6:34 a.m. No contact from team. Documentation had always been my quiet habit. Not defensive, just precise, because small timelines often reveal larger patterns later. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag. From where I sat, the elevator doors reflected faint shapes of people moving through the lobby. The office upstairs was continuing its normal morning routine. Slides are being reviewed, coffee cups are filling, final talking points discussed, and somewhere on the conference room screen, my optimization model was likely already loaded into the presentation deck. The system was moving forward exactly as expected. The only difference was that one small piece of the system was missing: me. For a moment, I wondered how long it would take before someone noticed. Not Maya. She was focused on details, probably assuming I was in another room preparing materials. The realization would likely reach Daniel first, and when it did, he would probably send a quick message asking where I was. Nothing dramatic, just practical, but the timing of that moment would matter, because the later it happened, the harder it would be to adjust the situation before the client arrived. I looked at the time again. 6:41 a.m., almost an hour since my keycard had flashed red. And upstairs, the presentation day was quietly moving closer. By 7:15 a.m., the lobby had grown noticeably busier. Employees from other companies in the building were arriving in steady waves, holding coffee cups and laptops, scanning their badges at the security gates without a second thought. Each time the reader blinked green for them, I noticed the small contrast. My own card still sat quietly in my bag. Red. Upstairs, our office floor would now be active. Lights on. People arriving. Analysts reviewing documents. The final preparation window before the 9 a.m. client meeting had begun. And that was when my phone finally vibrated. A message from Maya. "Hey Emily, are you already in the conference room?" I read the message once, then again. It wasn't urgent, just slightly confused, which meant something upstairs had begun to feel off. I replied calmly, "Not yet. Is everything set up?" The typing indicator appeared quickly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her response came through. "Daniel's reviewing the deck. I thought you were here earlier." That line told me two things immediately. First, Daniel had not mentioned that he expected me to arrive early. Second, Maya had assumed, like everyone else, that I would already be in the office preparing the room. The role had been internalized by the whole team. Reliable Emily, always early, always ready. I placed the phone back on my lap and looked toward the elevator bank again. A few minutes passed, then another message arrived, this time from Daniel. "Morning, are you in yet?" The wording was neutral, not concerned. "Just practical." I waited a moment before replying. "Keycard isn't working this morning." The message was simple. No explanation, no accusation, just information. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, then stopped, then started again. Finally, the reply came through. "That's strange. Can you ask security?" I looked at the screen for a few seconds. The suggestion itself was reasonable. Anyone encountering a building access issue would probably do exactly that. But the timing of the message was interesting. Daniel had been inside the office since before 6 a.m. More than an hour had passed, and this was the first time he had asked where I was, which meant my absence had only recently become noticeable. That realization told me something else. Preparation upstairs was continuing. Slides were being reviewed, coffee cups were being filled, the team was moving toward the client meeting as usual, but a small piece of the structure, the one responsible for explaining the deeper mechanics of the strategy, had quietly disappeared. Not dramatically, just enough to create uncertainty. I typed a short reply. "I will." Then I set the phone down again. Around me, the morning lobby noise continued. Elevator doors opened and closed. Security scanners blinked green. Another company's employees walked through the gates without interruption. Upstairs, the presentation day was moving forward. But for the first time that morning, something had begun to shift. Not panic, not confusion, just a small ripple of awareness. The kind that appears when people realize a system isn't functioning exactly the way they expected. And once that ripple begins, it rarely stays small for long. By 8:10 a.m., the rhythm of the morning had changed again. The lobby was no longer quiet. Commuters moved quickly through the security gates. Elevator doors opened and closed almost constantly, and the low hum of conversation filled the space. Upstairs, our office would now be fully active. Laptops open, slides on screens. Coffee cups are scattered across desks. And somewhere in the conference room, the presentation deck was probably already projected onto the wall. I was still sitting in the same chair near the window. My laptop closed, my notebook is resting quietly in my bag. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was Maya. "Emily, quick question about slide 14. Daniel's asking about the cost variance assumption." I read the message slowly. That question didn't surprise me. The cost variance calculation was part of the optimization model I had built. It looked simple on the slide, but the underlying assumption required a specific explanation. Without it, the chart could raise more questions than answers. I typed a calm response. "The variance adjusts based on regional overlap thresholds. It's in the model notes." A few seconds later, another message arrived. "He says the numbers still look off when he runs it with the southern distribution zone." I looked at the screen for a moment. That detail mattered, because the southern zone constraint had been one of the last adjustments I made the night before. The explanation for it sat inside a supporting sheet attached to the model. Something that made perfect sense if you had built the system, but much harder to interpret if you were only seeing the final chart. Before I could respond again, my phone buzzed with a call. "Daniel." I let it ring once before answering. "Morning," he said quickly. His voice sounded controlled, but slightly tighter than usual. "I'm looking at the model assumptions. The southern zone numbers don't align with the earlier projection." "They do," I replied calmly. "You just need the constraint sheet." A short pause. "Where is that?" "In the supporting file attached to the model." Another pause. Longer this time. "Right," he said. "I didn't see that earlier." The conversation stayed quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question he had probably been avoiding. "Have you gotten upstairs yet?" "Not yet," I said. "My keycard still isn't working." Silence filled the line again. Somewhere behind him, I could faintly hear movement in the office, voices, chairs shifting, the subtle sounds of preparation. The presentation clock was getting closer. Finally, he spoke again. "I'll call building security," he said. "See if they can reset it." "That's fine," I replied, but the moment had already changed. Because by the time a system problem is recognized, investigated, and corrected, time has already moved forward. The team upstairs was preparing for a presentation built around an analysis they didn't fully control. The client would arrive in less than an hour, and the person who understood the system behind the strategy was still sitting in the lobby, not angry, not rushing, just quietly observing how long it takes for people to realize that something they assumed was stable actually wasn't. And by the time Daniel finished his call with building security, one thing had become clear. Even if the door opened soon, the morning wasn't going to unfold the way he originally planned. At 8:32 a.m., the elevator doors finally opened for me. Building security had reset my access after Daniel contacted them. The process itself had taken less than 5 minutes. The delay had not been technical. It had simply required someone inside the office to request it. When the gate light turned green, I walked through quietly and took the elevator upstairs. The office floor felt different than usual that morning. Not chaotic, just tense. People were moving a little faster than normal. Maya looked up from her desk the moment I stepped out of the elevator. "Oh, good," she said, relief slipping into her voice. "We were trying to double-check the model assumptions." I gave a small nod and walked toward the conference room. The presentation was scheduled to start in 28 minutes. Inside the room, Daniel stood near the screen with his laptop open. The slide deck was already projected onto the wall. He looked up when I entered. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then he closed the laptop halfway and walked toward me. "You got in," he said. His tone was neutral. "Security reset the access." I placed my laptop on the conference table. "Yes." Another short pause. Daniel glanced at the screen behind him, where slide 14, the optimization model, was currently displayed. Then he looked back at me. "Strange issue with the building system this morning," he said. It sounded like the kind of sentence people use when they want an explanation to exist without examining it too closely. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stepped toward the screen and opened the presentation controls. The slide title appeared clearly at the top. Distribution Optimization Model. The attribution line was still gone. I clicked into the editing panel and typed one small change. Distribution Optimization Model, Emily Carter. Then I stepped back. Daniel watched the screen. His expression didn't change much, but the room stayed quiet for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "I adjusted the slide earlier while reviewing the deck." His voice remained calm, just simplifying the titles. "Whoa, I noticed," I said. The answer wasn't confrontational, just factual. Daniel nodded once, then he looked toward the clock on the wall. "Client will be here soon." "Yes," and the moment passed. No raised voices, no argument, just a quiet acknowledgement that both of us understood what had happened. In corporate environments, confrontation rarely looks like dramatic speeches. Most of the time, it's much simpler. Two people recognize that the structure of a situation has changed. Daniel turned back toward his laptop. "We'll start with the market overview," he said, "then move into the optimization section." "That works," I replied. The meeting would proceed, the client would see the strategy, and the model behind slide 14 would still do exactly what it was designed to do. But something subtle had shifted between us. Not hostility, just clarity. Because once a pattern becomes visible to both people involved, it stops being invisible. Invisible systems are the only ones that work without resistance. The presentation itself went smoothly. Clients asked the usual questions about distribution costs, operational risks, and long-term scalability. When the conversation reached the optimization model, Daniel introduced the strategy just as planned. Then the discussion moved into the details. That was the moment when the room naturally shifted toward me. Questions about assumptions, questions about regional constraints, questions about how the model adapted when demand changed. I answered them calmly, the same way I had done many times before. No tension, no awkwardness, just clear explanations. By the end of the meeting, the client's operations director leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "This is one of the more practical models we've seen," he said. The meeting ended with handshakes and polite smiles, nothing dramatic. But something inside me had already settled long before the client walked into the room. Because the morning in the lobby had clarified something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. For years, I had accepted the quiet role people assigned to me. Reliable, supportive, invisible when necessary. There's nothing inherently wrong with that role. Many successful systems rely on people who work carefully behind the scenes, but there is a difference between choosing that role and being confined to it. That morning had shown me the difference, not through confrontation, not through anger, just through observation. I realized something simple. My value in that company had never actually been invisible. The work spoke clearly whenever someone needed it. The real question had always been whether I was willing to let others define the limits of that value. After the client left, the office slowly returned to its normal rhythm. People gathered their laptops, coffee cups were thrown away. The quiet after a successful presentation settled across the floor. Daniel and I didn't revisit the conversation about the slide. We didn't need to. Some things become clear without discussion. A few weeks later, I made a decision about my future at the firm. Not because of that single morning, but because moments like it reveal the shape of a system. And once you understand the shape of a system, you can decide whether it's the place where you want to keep building your work. Today, when I look back at that morning, the locked door, the red light on the scanner, the quiet wait in the lobby, it no longer feels like a moment of conflict. It feels like a moment of definition, because sometimes the most important shift in your career isn't visible to anyone else. It's simply the moment when you realize who you actually are inside the story. And from that point forward, you begin writing the next chapters differently. When people hear stories about workplace conflicts, they often expect a dramatic ending. Someone exposed, someone embarrassed, a moment of public revenge. But real life rarely works that way. Most of the time, the most important outcomes happen quietly. No speeches, no scenes, just a shift in understanding. That morning in the lobby didn't end Daniel's career. It didn't explode into a confrontation in front of the team. And honestly, that was never my goal. What it did instead was something much simpler. It showed me the system I had been working inside with complete clarity. For years, I had allowed others to define my role. Reliable strategist. Quiet support. The person who made everything work behind the scenes. There's dignity in that kind of work. But dignity only matters when it's chosen, not when it's assumed. The moment my keycard flashed red that morning created an unexpected pause in the story. And that pause gave me something valuable. Perspective. I realized that influence doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the person who understands the structure beneath the conversation, the person who sees the patterns, the one who knows how the system actually works. A few weeks after that presentation, I accepted a position at another firm. Not out of anger, not to prove anything, simply because I wanted to build my work in a place where my voice was part of the strategy, not just the structure behind it. When I left, there were polite goodbyes, handshakes, and the usual professional messages. Nothing dramatic, just another quiet transition. And strangely enough, that felt like the most fitting ending possible. Because the real lesson of that morning wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't even about the locked door. It was about something deeper. Sometimes people underestimate you, not because they dislike you, but because you've allowed them to believe a smaller version of your role. And the moment you stop accepting that version, the entire story changes. So now, I'm curious about you. Have you ever had a moment where someone underestimated you so completely that it quietly changed how you saw your own place in the story?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!